like we kind of straddle these two things, I feel like, culturally. But the postmodern is like saying, hang on a second, you know, all of these promises of modernity, some of them have not been fulfilled, and they've been incorrect, or they've been naive, or they've been half-truths or whatever. So the postmodern perspective that you can feel in our culture as well is asking questions about, well, what was going on in this part of the world during all these years when there was all this progress happening? Or what about the dark sides of the progress related to slavery, or in the conquest of indigenous peoples, and whatever else has happened that is lamentable and that people don't want to dwell on because it's uncomfortable, and it requires really hard looking at ourselves and our history. All of that stuff kind of comes back up to the top, and there's questions about difference. Modernity is confident in sameness. Postmodernity is like, we can't even understand each other because we're so different. And and globalization is sort of capturing all of those tensions, I think, as a concept. Has anyone seen this movie, Trolls, or do you recognize it, or have you heard of the animated film? This is the second Trolls. The first one came out in 2016, and this is the sequel, which was released during pandemic times, so I don't think many people went to the theater to see it, but you could watch it, and it's really interesting. We watched this with my kids one time. I'm checking the chat real quick to make sure I'm not missing anything important from y'all. Yeah, cool. I'm gonna play a clip from it in a second, but let me give you the sort of what's going on in the background. This character in the middle, Poppy, she's the queen of the pop trolls. The premise of the story is that there are 6 tribes of trolls, and they all have they're divided by musical genre. So you have pop, you have, funk, there's rock, classical, techno, and country. And there's other kinds of music that show up too, but those are the big ones for them. And she's trying to figure out the bottom left-hand corner of this image is the queen of the rock trolls. Her name's Barb, and she's angry, and she hates all other kinds of music, and she embodies hard rock, and wants to steal the music of the other trolls and turn everybody into rock zombies. And so she's on a quest to do that, and Poppy wants to stop her. All right, so let me pull up this clip that kind of the idea is this captures. You'll notice this captures kind of a modern and a postmodern clash. These two ideas of being the same but being different in this conversation. In this one moment in the movie. I'm gonna see if this works. Let me know if y'all can hear it.
Well, Your Majesties.
Is that coming through? Okay, yes. Great.
I need your help to save all music from Queen Barb. If we combine our music, she'll see that music unites all trolls and that we're all the same, and that she's one of us.
Poppy, I mean, no disrespect, but king to queen, anything but that.
Why not?
Let's tell them how it was, Prince P.
Sid. Long ago, our world was without song or dance. Then the trolls found the strings, and life was one big party.
Oh yeah, I've heard this story before.
That is, until the pop trolls tried to steal our strings.
Steal your strings? That's not what it said in our scrapbooks.
Scrapbooks? Those are cut out, glued, and glittered by the winners. Let me tell you how it really went down.
Okay, so there's this great catchy song you can listen to another time for the next 2 minutes. I'm gonna skip it so we can pick up where the conversation resumes right here.
Yeah, right. And the trolls never lived in harmony again.
So the trolls live in isolation because of what Pop did?
Pop is her dad, the former king of the pop trolls.
Pop tried to destroy our music, just like Barb is trying to do.
I can make it right. History's just gonna keep repeating itself until we make everyone realize that we're all the same.
But we're not all the same.
It's why all our strings are different, because they reflect our different music.
Denying our differences is denying the truth of who we are.
I hadn't thought of it like that.
All right, so that's not the end of the story, of course, and I'll get back to why I think as Christians we have, good news to proclaim to that problem of the tension between the one and the many, and this perennial quest for dealing with difference. Let me get back to the slides for a second. So this is what I think is the task at hand for what I'm calling a theology of globalization. It has to respond to the challenges of the cries for liberation from political and economic oppression on the one hand, and the challenges posed by pluralism, ecological degradation, and cultural relativism or nihilism on the other hand. Those are in some ways the challenges of modern and postmodern forces coming together. So here's one way you could define globalization. Wikipedia says it this way, and it's good. The increasing interaction of people through the growth of international flows of money, ideas, and culture. And then this definition I think is even better. An older group of scholars in the 90s said, then the widening, deepening, and speeding up of global interconnectedness through growing spatial and temporal reach of transnational networks and flows. And there's a lot of technical abstract jargon in there, but you probably get the idea. And there's three key terms I put at the bottom to sort of characterize all the spirit of this, that whether we like it or not, and many people don't like it, by the way, we're moving toward, there are forces at work that are pushing us toward greater interconnection, integration, and interdependence as a species on the planet. And there's all kinds of conflict and challenge as a result. I especially like the word speed as a key idea here, because that's part of the difficulty, is how fast this is happening relative to speeds for most of human history, which we'll look at more closely again in a second. Some of the positive things, just to further characterize this age of globalization and what's gotten us here, you see things over the last, say, 50 or 60 years, especially through medical advances, technology, science, that have led to very good things like much lower infant mortality rates around the world. Where it was already low, it remains low, and where it was high, it's gotten lower. So each color bar there represents a different continent, and you see some of the more so-called underdeveloped continents have improved significantly. At the same time, by extension of this, that you've also seen life expectancy go up in those same regions, which has led to quite the population explosion, among other things. And here, you can really put this in perspective when you back up beyond even 1820. The graph starts there, but it took however long to get to 1 billion, like millennia. But then at 1 billion, we're at 2 billion people living on the planet in a relatively short time, about 100 years. That's how long it took to double from 1 billion to 2 billion. And then from 1 billion or 2 billion to 3 billion, just another maybe 30, 40 years. From 2 billion to 4 billion, only about 50 to 75 years. And then we crossed over 6 billion in the 90s, I think, and scholars are projecting we'll be at 12 billion by 2050. So the growth is just exponential. I mean, it's enormous. It's highly unprecedented. At no period has the Earth experienced anything like this in terms of humanity's growth and influence on it. So much so that, anthropologists and climate scientists, they call this the age of the Anthropocene, because there's no other greater distinctive in the history of the cosmos or of the Earth in this galaxy for this time period than the impact that human beings are having on the planet because of their growth and their consumption and their influence. I'm gonna come back to this in just a second, but here's a few more data points related to population growth and almost tracking it. it's a chicken and egg question to an extent, but they're correlated with production. You see, going back to 1500, like the level of estimated global GDP, like what is the production quantity economically of goods and services around the world, and how that stays somewhat constant for several centuries until you get to the late 19th century. It booms up because of the Industrial Revolution and some other factors, drops down because of the Great Depression, then skyrockets again to the present, just at enormously higher levels than it ever has been. And this all begs a question of like, okay, is this good or is this bad? And as you might guess, and as I'm sure you yourself would probably say, you know, it's a mixed bag. You know, one of the narratives of like why you might say it's good, and this is fair, comes from this idea that like things are evening out, you know, and more people are getting a chance to get on the field and play and have access to economic mobility and upward social mobility. Thomas Friedman wrote a book in the early 2000s. You might remember there were several editions of it, New York Times columnist, called "The World is Flat," drawing on this kind of funny thing that we used to think was true is now becoming true in its own way, as so many international corporations are able to outsource some of their labor to countries like India, set up call centers, have massive numbers of people move out of abject poverty into a more sustainable living wage, and how that is incentivizing all kinds of creative enterprise, entrepreneurship, and micro business around the world. In that sense, the world is more flat in many ways. To go back to this graph here, I didn't talk about this before. See, you see the two color groups, the red and the blue. And the red represents the number of people living at an abject poverty level, an absolute poverty line, which is measured by any wage lower than $1.25 per day in US terms. And how that has remained also fairly steady and even grown in the initial decades of what you could call, you know, the global age, but then starts to decline rather sharply in recent decades, which is very hopeful and interesting. And there's lots to ask about this, and there's metrics that can be interrogated, but this stands to reason that there are benefits to globalization that are spilling over into many parts of the world where there was otherwise just kind of real stagnant economic life. Now, some questions to ask though here might be something like, all right, well, what happens when you get above absolute poverty? Like, where do you go and how long do you stay there and all that? And indeed, there are another maybe 2 or 3 billion people living on not much more than that $1.25. And really, is that something to celebrate? You know, the $2 mark is even bigger than the $1 mark to cross over for the global population. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And then there's the question of, well, okay, but look at the growth curve. I mean, can this be sustained? At what point can we really provide sustainably a better than abject poverty life for the majority of 12 billion people? It's hard to say. It's kind of an ambiguous assessment just looking at these numbers, but there's some cause for, you know, for celebration as well and hope. And then obviously with the population increase comes the consumption increase, and following the production increase. So you see that in terms of fossil fuel consumption and the energy resources required, the carbon emitting kinds of fossil fuels, and how that's grown at this almost just parallel population growth. You know, what's been required to sustain this kind of life for this people, and what's propelled it, you know, has also been this energy consumption and extraction from the Earth's subsurface. And if you look at just like, where is this happening? I mean, it's not like it's evenly spread across the world. Y'all probably know this, but I mean, China and the US pretty much dwarf everybody else quantitatively. But it's significant to note that per capita, the the US is by far the most impactful, as China has something like 2 billion people and we have maybe 400 million. So we're almost as much high as they are, and yet we have, you know, one fourth or 1/5 of the number of people. So our footprint, so to speak, is certainly the largest. Now, people can get technical on this and they'll say, well, what about these other countries that have an even higher emission rate than we do, or total impact, you know, in terms of fossil fuel consumption? There are some that are higher. They're just really small, and they're in Europe. And overall, they just don't make a big difference because they're not big enough. And then I get into arguments, or not arguments, but I try not to get into arguments, but I hear conversation around this where people say things like, oh, you know, the US has these emission standards that are way better than a lot of the developing world. And that's true, but they're still consuming far less fossil fuel compared to us. And so our environmental impact remains much greater, even though we're cleaner per capita. And you know, statistics can be really manipulated in the ways we look at these things. So the point is that we're leading the way, we're driving, we're the trendsetter here in this pattern. Let me turn off my notifications real quick. All right. All right, switching gears for 1 second. This is y'all might know who Pitbull is. Nothing really important about him except that he had an album called Globalization that he put out one time, and this was in like 2014. And I thought that was interesting. Why did he call his album Globalization? And you look at, there was a famous song he did with J-Lo for the World Cup theme song that was called We Are One. And the lyrics suggest something here. He says, show the world where you're from. Show the world we are one. One love, one life. It's your world, it's my world, it's our world today. Your world, my world. We invite the whole world to play. And you get the sense, this goes back to kind of the trolls analogy. You get the sense sometimes that there's this optimism. There's this, especially in like liberal mainstream pop culture, the sense that if we would just wake up and see that we're not that different and have a generous spirit, we could all get along and we can move on and it'll be beautiful and good and harmonious. But that's not been obviously the case very much. And it's not been the attitude of many, many people in other parts of the world along the way. Because of some of the things I've already been talking about and the disproportionate experience of the effects of the aspects of this globalization process. Here, I'm trying to capture this phenomenon that for a while was called, you might have heard the term like in the 90s maybe, McDonaldization. Because McDonald's was a good example of a company that was spreading all over the world. You could find McDonald's in almost any country, popping up with the golden arch and going in and having the same kind of food that you can get in the US, which is really interesting when you go to a certain country where, you know, they have their own indigenous food that they're trying to, you know, live on, and that's part of their culture and their customs. And then McDonald's comes and it's like next door, and it's this strange thing. And it underscores a tendency in globalization to take what looks like, you know, the scaling up of a commodity, the commodification of something like McDonald's, and internationalization, and sends it everywhere, which is an amazing thing. And then people can benefit from that if it's a good product. But what you see is over time, these many, many different products that are being found everywhere are actually owned by a lot of the same companies, and there's not that much diversity. So in the case of, like, if you go to the supermarket or go to Costco or Target or wherever, Walmart, and you see all these brands, there's probably about 6 or 7 multinational corporations that own all of them. And so slowly but surely, you see this trend of taking something from one place, extracting it, broadcasting it, and trying to sell it elsewhere. And it's kind of like what happens when you take indigenous plant life, maybe out of its native soil, and try to plant it elsewhere, and then watch what happens and see the damage that can be done. The local life and ecology of that new environment can be harmed, can be negatively impacted as something foreign comes in and isn't made, hasn't evolved to be able to flourish in that place, or it does damage to what's already there. And the diversity, the indigenous nature of some of the customs in that place can start to erode and fall away and be kind of swallowed up or overwhelmed by the introduction of a new product or in the plant, to use the analogy. So accompanying a lot of this change is, of course, the movement from the rural to the urban. I think of just one example in my research was Mexico. Once the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed in the 90s, the U.S. was producing huge amounts of corn through big agricultural and industrial farming. And then it became cheap enough to export it and sell it to Mexico. Mexico being a country where all kinds of people were small scale rural farmers who had to sell at a certain price to make a living, and they couldn't once all this corn started flooding in. And they moved, forced out of their rural life into urban centers, which created all kinds of new problems working for factories at cheap wages that were built by the US and the border region. And this is a common trend across the world due to these globalizing forces. So one kind of cynical take would be like this cartoon here, where it shows, you've got the natural resources pouring in, the global cheap labor, and then just consumer junk and pollution emitting out, all of which drives GDP up and makes people say we're getting wealthier, we're getting more economically prosperous, which is not the whole story at all. But you can see why that story also sells and tells some truth. This is an African proverb, a comic that depicts this, I guess, adage where rich countries and governments mating with multinationals, elephants get together and many ants are crushed, as the saying goes. And I guess you can make the argument that some of the ants will benefit in the long run, but many are also dying in the process. Just trying to gather some of like the reactions and the interpretations and the cultural shifts that are happening abroad as a result of some of this process. All right, finally, still speaking internationally, and then I'm going to shift to domestic. This image, all too familiar and very sensitive, I show because we know this story well, and it hits home quite literally the tragedy, the loss of life, the horrors of this day, the injustice, and all that it represents. It has symbolic power for talking about precisely this topic. These are, in fact, the World Trade Center buildings getting targeted. And someone, somewhere, we know the story, doesn't like what Western globalization represents, whether that's religious, cultural, democratic, or whatever it might be, perceived or real imperial conquest of Middle Eastern oil or whatever. You know the different kind of storylines probably. And this was an attack claiming to be combating, resisting, and standing up against that for whatever other reasons might have been involved, including, of course, the Islamic extremist line of reasoning. So this is globalization and anti-globalization kind of par excellence depicted in one really shocking image. Y'all still with me? I know I'm saying a lot here. Okay. On the domestic front, and then we're going to hopefully wrap up the globalization conversation and move to some comments about theology and then get your questions. Domestically, this is affecting the U.S. as well. It's not as though this is just a question of the U.S. as a homogenous group and then everybody else. And we've been experiencing this in intense ways in recent years in our political climate, haven't we? This graph here illustrates another significant development where, because of the outsourcing of labor, because of the increased global labor supply, because of technological advances, because of women entering the workforce and many other factors in our own society, there has been downward pressure on wages, and compensation for the average worker in the US has stagnated relative to production and inflation. for several decades. And not everybody experiences this, but it's very real. And you can see one of the reasons has to do with this shift from manufacturing jobs to financial sector jobs, which includes many technology services jobs. That's grown over the last several decades as well, and led to a shortage of certain higher paying job workforce, and then a oversupply of kinds of work that's getting outsourced. So that the 80% and the top, or the bottom 80% of income earners in the US are making less and less money each year, again, adjusted for inflation, compared to the top 20 who have continued to see rising income or shares of total wealth. To finally bring us to this point where in the United States, this is just the United States, it's actually much worse in the rest of the world on average. You do see 46% of all wealth being held by 1% of the population, and 54% of it being held by the other 50% or by the other 99% of the population. So growing income and wealth inequality that seems to be exacerbated in part by globalization. Now, how is it that this can be the case where production continues to rise, but hourly compensation does not, and that allows for consumption to keep pace with productivity? Because if we have less money, how are we still buying stuff at the rate of its production?
Hey, Bill,
and the answer to that,
Bill, is this the U.S. or the world that we're looking at?
This is thanks, Paul. Yeah, sorry, this is the U.S.
Thanks.
I'm speaking domestically now. Yeah. I think the clearest theory is that around the early 1980s, you saw introduction and extension of greater lines of credit through credit cards to much more people, many more consumers in our country. And you see credit debt rising, credit card debt rising as a result to keep pace with a certain standard of living. Savings per household, continues to shrink, and that's a result of this phenomenon. So the tension, that the kind of hostility and angst that's growing between the wealthy and the poor, that kind of shrinking middle class narrative is real and pronounced, and is part of what I think we're feeling as well politically. So here are some summary statements, y'all, about what I've just said. In terms of economics, resource scarcity, overconsumption, production, population explosion, cheap labor supply, wage stagnation. Politically, growing tension internationally as a result of new security threats due to technological advancements, cybersecurity, rising costs and debt, and anti-globalization ideology, terrorism, and other groups, kind of non-government groups that are trying to resist and carve out their own niche, and that's challenging this dominant trend. Culturally, and very related to the political, is the effect on local traditions, customs, and values. They're being eroded by mass marketing, consumerism, media, and production at these economies of scale. Environmentally, non-renewable resource depletion, global warming and climate change, that whole study and debate, waste disposal, water supply, and sanitation still remains an issue in many parts of the world. Okay, pausing there. What I'm going to attempt to do now in just a few minutes, and then hopefully leave plenty of time for y'all to ask questions, is make some general statements in response to this that are drawing on, without going through the work of justifying all my kind of discipleship, mission, ecclesial, theological claims. I'm going to kind of make some assumptions about a common Christian understanding of our own faith here, and go straight to some practical steps, and then I'm going to back up and show where I think theologically this is all rooted, kind of reverse the order a little bit. So in response to the economic challenges I just named, I think that Christians are positioned and have a especially urgent opportunity and task here to challenge this growing, it's timeless, but it's also a growing resource scarce mindset And this spirit of globalization, that there's a competitive race to acquire and produce and consume and secure what's depleting. We can challenge that by first of all, just meeting each other's needs as churches, as people who are part of the body, not fearing for our own security or future, by generously sharing our possessions and creating a kind of divine commonwealth amidst ourselves. And by saying amidst ourselves, I'm not saying to exclude that from others, or that we won't have agency in our own political process or policy or economies. I just mean it starts with how we, through generosity toward one another, can show a different way and can point to another way of being related when it comes to our material well-being and our possessions. The Acts 2 picture, if you will, of Christian life and the birth of the church. Secondly, and the political and the cultural, again, will be closely related here. We've seen this most of all in recent weeks with the insurrection and with this rising nationalism that can sometimes have a Christian flag waving behind it. The proclamation that we're not loyal or defined by any one nation state above another, holding community together with both unity and diversity under Christ's lordship and in his kingdom. That's our primary citizenship. Goes without saying in many ways, but we need to say it because the competing allegiances nationally are sometimes, or familially, or class or race lines can become what divide us more than when we're not first submitted to the lordship of Christ and his kingdom. Culturally, there's a posture as well of desiring to influence and perhaps transform by rooting ourselves in, rather than competing with, dominating, or destroying culture that we feel opposed to. That's maybe has different messages or different values. Throughout the history of the spread of Christianity, you see this in powerful ways where the gospel is able to take root and grow up in very, very different kinds of places without needing to import foreign cultural expressions. Now, unfortunately, many times throughout our history, y'all know this story well, Christians have imported and colonized and brought unnecessarily, perhaps Western assumptions, or even forced people to assimilate to a kind of Christendom, way of life that may or may not have to do with the gospel itself or the genuine spread of the kingdom. But we also see beautiful examples of this happening in ways that you won't find probably in the study of the spread of Islam, for instance. You won't find it as much in Eastern religions. They don't have that same kind of mission and purpose. It's really unique to Christianity to be able to have indigenous expressions of Christian worship and Jesus following in all kinds of different cultures around the world. Truly a global religion for the global age. And then environmentally, nothing too creative here, just that our theology supports and insists on a responsibility of stewardship and caretaking of creation. That this is our sanctuary and our home. We're not leaving. Rather, we're waiting and wanting to point toward the renewal of it. So we inhabit it in that fashion to cultivate it for flourishing and sustainability, and inviting others to do the same who maybe don't even share our faith. So here, these are some of the practices that I think undergird a Christian alternative to the spirit of globalization without necessarily doing violence to it in the way that some more extreme religious groups might want to. And I think this is supported by doctrines that y'all know well. The incarnation and the Trinity come to mind most of all, perhaps. That Jesus is both God and human is the great paradox. It's the scandal of particularity, it's sometimes been called, to suggest that in this one time and place and person, God was fully present in a way that God never has been in any other time. And yet that he was God, that he was the transcendent, creator of the universe. And that allows for a kind of one in many unity that is again, no other faith, no other worldview is that bold in what it's saying. The Trinity allows us to believe both in God's power over this whole process, God's providence, and God's proximity, God's intimacy, God's involvement, God's closeness to it through the Spirit, and demonstrated most of all by Christ, so that we don't have to choose between the transcendent God of the monotheist traditions and the immanence of like pantheism and Eastern religions. Both of those things are there, and they're not competing with each other. The atonement is dealing with the sins, the violence, the past, the injustices and the suffering of what's come before, but not in merely a retributive, vindictive, and judging way. God is judge, but the gospel is offering reconciliation in light of that judgment, in response to that judgment, as God has taken on and taken away the things that we've done that have harmed each other and offended God. And again, here, I don't think that kind of story is being told anywhere else. It seems that moving forward without one who can judge in light of history's atrocities is nearly impossible. And one of the things that continues to drive us into our postmodern kinds of ghettos. It takes Christ to atone for those things, to bring us together. Lastly, and I've said this already, so I'll be brief, ecclesiologically, because of our body politics' untethered allegiance to nation state, unlike, again, many of the great other religious traditions, whether it's Islam or Judaism, for example, who remain very tethered, I think, to land and to institution in a way that Christianity doesn't need to be. We are free to be citizens of another kingdom while nonetheless caring a great deal about our neighbors and seeking the common good around us. I'll stop there, you guys. There's too much to say about this, and I've gone too long. I want to leave time for conversation.
So we just want to have an
So,
open. Okay, never mind. Yep.
Yeah, guys. What struck you? Where's their confusion? Where's their curiosity? I want to know anything that is that comes to mind, and what are y'all thinking in response to any of this? I meant to stop at one point early on, and I forgot, so I just kind of kept going.
I just wanted to, Rachel here, I just wanted to start off with saying thank you for your presentation. It was really thorough and informative and good. I was, I think, a bit overwhelmed and unsettled, but it was very good still. And more of a comment, I guess, that one part when you were talking about, I think, like expansion and how I guess in some ways it can be good, but in some ways it can be very bad when, when things can get like pushed out, or environmentally where you're trying to like bring something in and that kind of destroys some of the local things. And it just reminded me of a trip that I took to Zambia, and that was one of the things that kind of came up during my trip, where sometimes people would come in like kind of under this guise of like helping and be very genuine, the intent, but sometimes we'll, rather than asking like what the people actually want, we're saying like what we think they need. And just like one example of that, like the people that we worked with, sometimes people would come in and be like, oh, we would describe them as poor, but they wouldn't describe themselves that way. And so we're doing things like, oh, we're helping you, but it's like, oh, they don't even perceive themselves that way. So now your intentions are not even like met or being met necessarily. So I think it just reminded me of that, and just other things that you brought up. So again, just thank you. And reminded of some things.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really, so much of what you said is worth sitting with longer than we can. But one thing that I think was a check on perhaps something that could have been taken from what I just shared is that our interpretation, right, of the well-being of others is not necessarily accurate in their eyes. And some people might be quite content and quite fulfilled despite the perhaps simpler or less affluent, lifestyle they're leading. And it's not for us to say necessarily in every case.
Yeah, piggybacking at Anne. Hi, thank you for your talk. Very interesting, lots of good stuff to think about. I was also thinking that when I saw the the graph, I thought, well, what is the definition? I mean, $1 something a day. Who's defining what quality of life is, or what kind of life is, like, how does that measure happiness? Just in a purely economic sense, like our judgments about whose frame is that coming from? It does seem like a Western, white Anglo frame potentially, since there's probably a lot of statistical correlation with the 1% of folks. I don't know. Yeah. So thank you for that. Thank you, Rachel, for saying that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I think, I think that bears repeating. And it's not a but, it's an and. There is still this measurement, right? That I don't think you're suggesting is not there, of like, people have to eat. People have to have, if people are starving, they're probably not happy about that. And so there is 1 billion people or so, at least, who are facing that kind of insecurity in their lives on a daily basis, or they're drinking water that should not be dirty and should not be, spreading these kinds of diseases, and it is preventable. And there's a way to go about getting ourselves involved in that effort, and there's a way not to. And often, many of these problems are caused by not because we haven't done something that we should for them. That's the kind of, like you're saying, sort of Eurocentric way to approach it, but rather because of something we have done for ourselves that has indirectly affected the well-being of others, because of we're living in a way that's not, we could all simply ask, how could we live in such a way that everyone could also live, and that question doesn't get asked in terms of our consumption, in terms of what we're impacting as Christians in the world. I don't hear that conversation happening maybe as much as it should be for us as Christians.
Bill,
I'll jump in here. My name's Josh. Just curious, first of all, as they've said, thank you. 2 questions here, and just curious to know your thoughts. Number one, where would you go if you wanted more? I found all of it fascinating. I love how you've been connecting the dots between things that are social, cultural, theological, economic. So the first part, where would we go if we wanted more? Should we read some of the books that you recommended, or is there a way to get connected with you? I don't know. And then the second part of that, which maybe we're all interested in, would be what would you recommend we do about it personally, corporately? Even is there a network? Is there a church that's involved in something here locally to help combat some of these things, or be part of the solution, or if not, could there be? I know that maybe that's too open-ended, but just curious to know your thoughts there. Where might we go for more, and what might we do about some of these things?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. There's many things I could say in response, but I'll try to be real succinct. One book that came to mind first is by a guy named Oscar Garcia Johnson. He's a theologian at Fuller Seminary, and he wrote a book along with somebody else named William Dryness called Theology Without Borders. And the subtitle is an introduction to global conversations. And I think it's really good. It's popular level, meaning it's not dumbed down, but it's not huge, it's not a tome, and it's not overly academic. So Theology Without Borders, great book. And yeah, I think what we can do, for me, it really is first it's not only, but it feels kind of first about some growing awareness. Hence kind of this conversation, like recognizing that our allegiance, trying to practice a truly kingdom of God citizenship in our church. And different churches struggle with this in different ways, before and way beyond anything partisan, where like if our consciousness about being politically active is something like this, and I think it is in most Christian environments, national politics is like up here and local politics is like down here. Like that needs to shift a lot. Where local, and by local politics, I don't mean like necessarily just voting for, your school board representative. I do mean that, but this is holistic. This is food, this is education. I mean, this is housing. This is neighborhood, public space. This is how we inhabit our space as the church. Those conversations at a neighborhood level, I think, are the ones that I'm talking about. This knowing our local, very local economies, knowing every dimension of it, and not being experts, just being listeners, just being good neighbors. I think it starts there. And then I think that becomes the primary lens we're looking out through when we ask political questions. Not that we can ignore, and I'm not saying we should not care about, the federal, that matters too. But I think we start a little closer to home.
Thank you.
Bill, it's okay, kind of a comment leading to a question. So, my background, living about half my adult life over in Asia, seeing kind of like the forces of capitalism, good and bad, in a way that's like very, very real. Because, on one hand, I've seen a lot of the downside of kind of where global capitalism has pushed people, fragmenting families, pressures of urbanization, pollution. On the other hand, a lot of the people that we knew in China, if we got them talking about their childhoods, they would say, yeah, when we were kids, we just basically didn't get protein ever. Once a month we would get meat and maybe, get an egg every once in a while. And you can see a generational difference in just the height of the people, and how they're physically working. And as, pretty directly connected to the opening up of China to global markets and, free markets, both with, promoting a form of capitalism within the country and then like globally. And then I've spent a lot of time in Chinese factories where, there's work conditions that we wouldn't tolerate, and yet people are intentionally riding trains for 2 days to get to that job, and happy to have it, so that they can kind of change the trajectory of their life.
Yeah.
So, I feel like kind of Christianity and capitalism is a question that, is another way of kind of framing this. And as Americans, I think we can sometimes also too easily hit kind of an anti-capitalist button that will, I'm going to boycott everything made in China, as if all the ripple effects of that wouldn't necessarily have tons of other unintended consequences in people's lives. So I guess my question for you is, like, first, if you want to respond to those comments, but also just like very concretely, would you be willing to share something specific about your consumer choices? And especially like when it comes to like global markets, are there places you boycott? Are there brands you boycott for some of those reasons? And feel free to dodge that if that's too controversial or private. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Yeah. What's so hard, gosh. And when I talk about this with students at Baylor who are going to business school and thinking about, I didn't mean to say, and I try not, in other places I try to take longer to not say that, this outsourcing phenomenon and the development of manufacturing class labor and the expansion of capitalism in the East, even though it's a centralized capitalism, a different kind of capitalism, like you say, in China, is all bad by any means. And that some of our Western lenses prevent us from seeing, oh, there's good that's coming from this. I do think one of the bigger challenges, speaking now still macro, and then I'll get to my own life, like, is like, okay, that's glad that there's growing industry and more jobs, and maybe even hopefully wages are still a little higher sometimes in those factories than would be otherwise. The hardest thing with I think global trade is the energy consumption right now. Is that it's that while I'm glad there's employment over there, I'm glad we can have comparative advantages economically. It's just enormously costly, not necessarily monetarily, but on the environment to continue this kind of purchasing here what was made over there. You know all the steps that go into getting that product home to us. And that's where, yes, I am conscious of that. I am trying to, whether it's clothing or in many cases food, seasonal food, those kinds of things, to be as aware and as selective as I can be without, I'm not like dogmatic about it. I probably was more when I was younger. Now I have kids and I get like these gifts of like clothing and stuff. And like, do I tell my people who are giving us like a baby shower, like no products from this place? It's really hard because you feel like you're being such a stickler, but we need to do some of that. And I guess that's again where I want to ask the church to lead more so than just, make a list of places not to buy or not. Like, how do we have a conversation about that? Recognizing that it's not black and white, that we're not going to be purist. We can't. It's almost impossible. I mean, Amazon would be another huge category here, right? To talk about. Can you really live without Amazon? It's so difficult. And I don't know that the task is as simple as that, like just boycotting. But I think we need to be willing. I don't think we should blow that off either. I don't know. I'm sorry if that's not a sufficient response.
Let's grab coffee.
Yes, please. I got a question, Bill. It's maybe, we'll see if I can make this an actual question. One of the things I've thought a decent amount about in this regard and relating to globalization is like this kind of strand of, it's like, it's typified by someone like Wendell Berry, and it's picked up by a lot of Christians who celebrate place, like as opposed to space, and the idea of like not privileging, but celebrating local traditions and resisting the McDonaldization of everything. And that's not, and it's, Wendell Berry might not be like a kind of confessing Orthodox Christian, but he kind of is. But there are definitely people who are more explicit Christians who draw on like Walter Brueggemann, for example, and the Old Testament conception of the land, and this notion that Christians are to be rooted in particular places, and in some ways, like not be global citizens. But all those people recognize the global nature of the church. It's not that they don't realize that, but there is a tension between that kind of celebrating the local and the particular and being kind of rooted somewhere versus the kind of Catholic notion of our faith. And like, as like missionaries, demonstrate like, you can be anywhere, any place, and have a family and a home in the church. So I wonder, I'm not asking you to resolve that tension, but I'm asking if you've ever thought about that and how Christians can, on the one hand, be local and celebrate what's local in particular, but also not become, bound or parochial in their outlook and understanding. Does that even make sense? Could you, I don't know, if so, maybe try and speak to it.
Yeah, I'd like to think that there's not as much of a tension there. You're not even suggesting there is this huge tension, but like, it seems like by being local, there's a way, I should say, of being local that is being local precisely because you recognize our global interdependence, precisely because you recognize our community, globally. And it is for that reason that we're not going to, global capitalism is an exercise in abstraction, in that it's trying to make you not think about or see the sources of the things you're consuming because it's just presented to you, voila, it disconnects it from the supply chain and the relational steps along that way. And so to be local is to resist all of that, which is to be aware actually of the global, in a way that most people who are not living local are not aware of their global situatedness and contingency. So I'm kind of turning around on you without, but still recognizing that when it comes to the Catholicity of the church, it's critical for us to maintain that. And maybe that means conferencing without flying 3 places, 3 times a year. And we're having to do that anyway right now, which is an interesting experiment for still trying to be incarnate, in our local parishes, but maybe we don't have to, use jet fuel as much to be a universal church, for instance.
That's
Maybe,
just me.
yeah. One
Sorry,
more question. No, yeah, I think one more question. Yeah, I think let's end it with Bronwyn.
Oh, this isn't so much as a question, but I just a follow up maybe on what you said, Nick, or where you're going with the tension that I sometimes have come across with globalization. I think that the idea that if we are all the body of Christ, there's this idea, in the kingdom, and there's just going to be one culture, and so I've met some folks that are sort of resistant to this idea of localness and difference, because they really somehow have maybe pasted on this idea that no, we're all it's going to be this one monolith. They've and so they're sort of with that coming, then you get smuggling in oh, well, what's wrong with there being McDonald's everywhere? That's the extreme, but that's the idea. Well, if it's maybe not McDonald's, but at some point, we'll all just have the same good, we'll all just have TJ Maxx's, and won't that be great? Right. And I saw that's kind of where I don't know if that's where you were leading with the tension. That's something that I've experienced. And I'm it's great to have super hyper local stuff. And I'll get certain family members pushing back and be okay, yeah, whatever, hipster, blah, blah, blah. So maybe, I don't know if that's where you're going, but I've experienced that, and I kind of have to wrestle with that myself.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think you're also asking a question, but I would agree with what I thought I heard was your point or your implication that, it's certainly not the case that I don't think we should. I don't think the Bible depicts the kingdom or the new heaven and the new earth in such a way that it's monocultural, monolithic, or anything like that. In fact, the many tribes and tongues and nations imagery strikes me as the opposite of that, as mosaic, as showing God's diversity even more than we have ever been able to see it in one body. And that is, I think, again, the importance of Jesus as the model of how the one God is salvation for the many nations, and how Israel is different from the world for the sake of the world, not to assimilate, but to become host, where there's authentic planting of the gospel into their soil, and it takes native root, but still brings the transcendent truth, the timeless hope. Because there are still these common, we just have to, it's so basic, we have to remember to name what are the common human things. Christian anthropology becomes really important. We all need community. We all need material provision. We all need connection, communion with the Father. These are all things we need. And so those are the things that are one. And then there's a lot that's not. And that leaves quite a bit of room for maybe more creativity than we even can see now.
All right, that's a great note to end on. Bill, thank you so much for your time and your expertise, being so generous with us. I'm sure you'd be open to follow up from any individual that might have further questions. Is that true to say?
Absolutely. Love being with y'all, and thank you for your questions. And I welcome more and further conversation. And you know where to find me, I think. So,
what's your email address? I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, Bill at christchurchofAustin.org is great.
All right, awesome. Paul, would you pray us, close us out?
Yes, let's pray. Lord, we need your wisdom. We are burdened by basically not having this kind of complete local, knowing only what's on the horizon that we can see. world. We are flooded with what is happening around this world, Lord, and that burden has seemed so much that some ways, Lord, we opt out in so many different ways. Either just turn it off, I don't want to know, or cut it off in a different way. And Lord, we are your chosen, honored to be your sons and daughters. Lord, let us stand on this earth with that sense of this is our dad's planet, this is our father's place, and these people are his that we buy from and sell to. And Lord, for these supply chains that go all the way back, Lord, we pray that you would give our church, our people, wisdom to know how to interact in this global world with grace and truth. And Lord, give us wisdom to know how to be innocent as doves, but also shrewd as serpents in this context, and how we move about this place. Thank you for Bill, Lord. Keep him lifted up, protect him from any form of enemy, spiritual or physical, for his family. Keep them healthy and safe. We thank you and praise you in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks you all so much.
Will this
Thanks,
be
friend.
available?
Yes, I recorded it. I forgot like the first 3 minutes, and then I started recording. So yeah, we'll have it available.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
y'all. Blessings.